The scent of old paper and leather bindings lulled Violet Grayson into sleep somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, her head pillowed on a stack of linguistic journals she'd been cross-referencing for the past 6 hours. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. The Nocturnal Archives weren't the sort of place where one simply dozed off. Membership cost more than her entire semester's stipend, and she'd only gained access through her advisor's connections. But the exhaustion of her doctoral work had finally caught up with her, and the silence of the reading room had felt too much like comfort. When she woke, the first thing she noticed was warmth. Heavy, enveloping warmth that shouldn't have been there in the perpetually cool archive. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the pale gray light filtering through the tall windows. Dawn. She'd slept for hours. The second thing she noticed was the coat. It lay draped across her shoulders and back, falling nearly to the floor when she sat up. Velvet, deep burgundy, lined with silk that whispered against her skin. It smelled of cedar and something else, something darker and richer that she couldn't quite name. Old books, maybe. Old smoke. Old time itself. Violet looked around the reading room with sudden alertness, her heart hammering. The room was empty except for one figure. A man sat in the leather armchair across from her reading table, positioned between her and the door. He sat perfectly upright despite being clearly asleep, his hands resting on the chair's arms, his head tilted back just slightly. His hair fell past his shoulders in a cascade of pure silver white, catching the dawn light like moonlight on water. His skin was equally pale, luminous in a way that seemed to generate its own soft glow rather than merely reflecting the light around him. He was the most beautiful person Violet had ever seen, and the most terrifying. Even in sleep, he radiated authority. He wore a black shirt and trousers that looked tailored to perfection, and around his throat, a silver pendant caught the light. His features were sharp and aristocratic, his mouth set in a line that suggested he rarely smiled. His hands were long-fingered and elegant, and on one of them, she saw a ring that matched the pendant. She knew what he was before her conscious mind fully processed it. Every instinct in her body screamed the truth. Vampire. Violet's breath caught. She'd never seen one before. Most people hadn't. Vampires weren't exactly common, and they didn't advertise themselves. But everyone knew they were real. The revelation had happened 20 years ago, a carefully orchestrated announcement that, yes, vampires existed. Yes, they had always existed. And no, they were not particularly interested in human affairs unless humans made themselves interesting. The reading room's silence pressed against her ears. Outside, she could hear the city beginning to wake. Car engines, distant voices. But inside, there was only her breathing and the absolute stillness of the man who had apparently guarded her through the night. Why? She looked down at the coat again, then back at him. The positioning of his chair was deliberate. He'd placed himself between her and any possible entrance. He'd given her his coat, which must have been expensive beyond her imagining. And he'd stayed. All night. As she watched, his eyes opened. They were gray, pale as winter ice, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He studied her with an expression that revealed nothing, and she stared back because she couldn't seem to do anything else. "Good morning," he said finally. His voice was low and precise, carrying an accent she couldn't place. It sounded old, shaped by languages that might have died centuries ago. "I apologize if I startled you." "You didn't," Violet lied. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. "Thank you for the coat. The archive maintains an aggressive cooling system." You were shivering. She had been, she remembered now. The cold had seeped into her bones hours before she'd fallen asleep, but she'd been too focused on her work to care. "Still," she said, "thank you, and thank you for—" She gestured vaguely. "Staying?" Something flickered in his expression. Not quite amusement, but close. "You're welcome." "I'm Violet." She stood, pulling his coat from her shoulders and holding it out to him. The loss of its weight and warmth felt more significant than it should have. Violet Grayson. He stood as well, moving with a fluid grace that confirmed everything her instincts had told her. When he took the coat from her hands, his fingers brushed hers. They were cool but not cold, and the brief contact sent a shiver up her arm that had nothing to do with temperature. "Wolfgang Kravetz," he said. The name suited him. Old world, powerful, carrying weight. "What were you working on?" he asked, glancing at the papers spread across her table. "If I may ask." Violet looked down at her research. Photocopies of ancient texts, her own notes in 3 different colors of ink, linguistic charts that mapped phonetic evolution across centuries, the passion project that was slowly consuming her life. "Dead languages," she said. "Specifically, I'm trying to reconstruct one that's been lost. Valdric. It was spoken in Eastern Europe, probably until the 17th or 18th century, but then it just disappeared. No native speakers, no written records beyond a few fragments. It's like an entire culture's voice just went silent." She was rambling. She always rambled when she talked about her work. But when she looked up, Wolfgang wasn't wearing the polite but glazed expression most people got when she discussed linguistics. He was staring at her papers with an expression she couldn't read, something between shock and pain and hunger. "Valdric," he repeated. The word sounded different in his mouth, rounder, fuller, alive. "You're researching Valdric." "You've heard of it?" Violet's heart leapt. "Most people haven't. There's barely any academic literature. I'm working from fragments and cognate comparison and educated guesswork mostly. If you know anything about it, anything at all." "I know it," Wolfgang said quietly. He reached out, his hand hovering over her papers but not quite touching them. "I know it because it was my language. I was Valdric." The reading room seemed to hold its breath. "That's impossible," Violet whispered. "The last speakers would have died 300 years ago at least, unless—" She looked at him again, really looked at him, and understanding crashed through her. "How old are you?" "Old enough." He pulled his hand back, curling it into a fist at his side. "Old enough to have watched my language die with my people. Old enough to be the only one left who remembers how we spoke, how we laughed, how we mourned." His voice remained steady, but something in it made Violet's throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. If this is painful, I won't—" "No." The word came out sharp, almost desperate. "No, please, continue your work. It's just—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I never thought I would hear anyone else care about Valdric again. I thought I was the last keeper of ghosts." Violet understood then why he had stayed, why he had given her his coat and guarded her through the night. She'd been sleeping with her head on papers covered in fragments of his lost world, and he'd watched over her like she was something precious. "Will you help me?" she asked. The question came out before she could second-guess it. "I'm trying to reconstruct the phonology and grammar from what little exists. But if you actually speak it, if you remember it—" She could hear the pleading in her own voice. "You're a living primary source. You're everything I've been searching for." Wolfgang was silent for a long moment. The dawn light grew stronger, and she saw him glance toward the windows with something that might have been wariness. "I need to leave," he said. "The sun—" "Right. Of course. Vampires and sunlight." She'd been so caught up in the revelation about Valdric that she'd forgotten the obvious. "But can I see you again? Can we meet and talk about this, please?" He looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "Yes," he said. "Tonight, if you wish. The archive opens at sunset." "I'll be here." Violet grabbed one of her papers and scribbled her phone number across the bottom. "In case you need to reach me, or if you change your mind about coming." Wolfgang took the paper, studying it as if it contained something more significant than 10 digits. "I won't change my mind." He moved toward the door, his coat now draped over his arm. But he paused at the threshold and looked back at her. "Violet," he said. Her name sounded different in his mouth too, shaped by that ancient accent. "Thank you." "For what?" "For caring about languages no one else remembers, for caring about people no one else mourns." He inclined his head in something that looked like a bow. "Until tonight." Then he was gone, moving so quickly that he seemed to simply vanish into the shadowed hallway beyond. Violet stood alone in the reading room, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She'd come to the archive looking for fragments of a dead language. She'd found its last living speaker instead. The day passed in a blur of restless energy. Violet tried to work, tried to sleep, tried to eat. Nothing held her attention. Her mind kept circling back to Wolfgang Kravetz, to the pain in his voice when he'd said he was the last keeper of ghosts, to the way he'd looked at her research papers like they held pieces of his soul. She returned to the Nocturnal Archives an hour before sunset, unable to wait any longer. The building was a converted mansion in the old part of the city, all Gothic architecture and tall windows and heavy wooden doors. During the day, it served as a regular research library. At night, it opened its special collection to members only, and the special collection was where the truly rare materials lived. The reading room where she'd fallen asleep was empty when she arrived. She spread her materials across the same table, organizing them more carefully this time. She wanted to be ready. She wanted to make the most of whatever time Wolfgang would give her. He arrived exactly at sunset. She didn't hear him come in. She simply looked up from her notes and he was there, standing in the doorway as if he'd materialized from the shadows themselves. He wore different clothes tonight, a deep blue shirt and black trousers, but the silver pendant still hung at his throat and the ring still gleamed on his finger. "You came," Violet said, and heard the relief in her own voice. "I said I would." Wolfgang crossed to the table, moving with that same liquid grace. "I keep my promises." "I wasn't sure. I thought maybe you'd wake up and decide this was a terrible idea, digging up the past, talking about," she gestured helplessly, "about pain. The past is all I have." He sat in the chair across from her, the same one where she'd found him sleeping that morning. "Pain shared is lighter than pain carried alone, or so I've been told. I never had the opportunity to test the theory." Violet's chest tightened. "How long have you been alone?" 312 years. He said it as easily as someone might say 3 hours or 3 days. Give or take a decade, time becomes fluid after the first century. She couldn't imagine it, couldn't fathom that kind of solitude, that kind of loss. 3 centuries of being the only one left, the only one who remembered. "Tell me," she said softly. "Tell me about Valdric. Not the language, not yet. Tell me about the people. What were they like?" Wolfgang's expression shifted. For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes growing distant. "Proud," he said. "We were proud to the point of arrogance, perhaps. We believed we were chosen, special, that our blood and our language marked us as superior to other vampire lineages. We kept to ourselves, high in the mountains, in castles that had stood for thousands of years. We had our own customs, our own laws, our own way of seeing the world." His mouth twisted. "We thought our isolation would protect us. We thought we were untouchable." "What happened?" Violet asked, though she could already guess. Nothing good could explain why he was the last. "Be hunters." The word came out flat and cold. "A family of them, the Reinhardt line. They approached us under a banner of truce. They said they wanted to negotiate, to establish peace between vampires and humans in our region. They seemed sincere. They brought gifts, shared our meals, learned our ways." He paused. "They learned our language." Violet's stomach dropped. "So they could understand you? Know your plans, your weaknesses?" "Yes." Wolfgang's hands tightened on the chair's arms. "They stayed with us for months, long enough to map our strongholds, identify our leaders, discover our secrets. And then one night, they struck. They had weapons we'd never seen before, blessed silver that burned like sunlight, gases that paralyzed. They killed everyone, women, children, elders. They burned our libraries, destroyed our records, erased every trace of our existence." His voice remained steady, but his eyes held centuries of grief. "I survived because I was away that night. I returned to find ash and silence." "Wolfgang." Violet reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with hers. His skin was cool beneath her palm, but not unpleasantly so. "I'm so sorry." He looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "I hunted the Reinhardts afterward. It took me 50 years, but I found them all, every member of that generation. I made them answer for what they'd done." He met her eyes. "I'm not proud of my vengeance, but I'm not ashamed of it either." "And the language died with your people?" "Yes. I tried to write it down, preserve it somehow, but I'm a warrior, not a scholar. I could speak Valdric, live in it, but I couldn't capture it on paper. The grammar, the nuances, the way words changed meaning based on context and intonation. I didn't have the knowledge to save it, so it died with them. And I became the last speaker of a language no one else would ever hear." He turned his hand over, his fingers curling around hers. "Until now. Until you." The touch sent warmth through Violet's entire body. She should pull away. This was too much, too fast, too intense, but she couldn't make herself let go. "I want to bring it back," she said. "Not just reconstruct it for academic purposes. I want to make Valdric live again. A full grammar, a dictionary, recordings of proper pronunciation. I want it to be something people can learn, something that can be spoken and taught and passed on. Would you help me do that?" Wolfgang stared at her for a long moment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why does this matter to you? It's not your language, not your people. You have no connection to Valdric except academic interest." "Because every language that dies takes an entire worldview with it," Violet said. The words came from her heart, from the passion that had driven her into linguistics in the first place. Every language is a unique way of seeing reality, understanding existence, expressing what it means to be alive. When a language disappears, we lose that forever. We become poorer as a species, smaller, less than what we were. She squeezed his hand. "And because no one should have to carry that much loss alone, you've been the sole keeper of your people's memory for 3 centuries. Let me help you share it. Let me help you make sure they're remembered." Something broke in Wolfgang's expression, not dramatically, not with tears or obvious emotion, but she saw it in the softening of his eyes, the way his shoulders released tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I'll help you. I'll teach you everything, every word, every grammatical structure, every piece of my people that I still carry." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Thank you, Violet Grayson. Thank you for seeing us, for caring that we existed. Thank you for trusting me with this." She smiled at him and was rewarded by a small, hesitant curve of his mouth in return, the first almost smile she'd seen from him. "When do we start?" "Now, if you wish." Wolfgang pulled his hand from hers, and she felt the loss of contact like a physical thing. "We should begin with phonology. Valdric has sounds that don't exist in modern English, and if you're going to record proper pronunciation, you'll need to train your ear." They worked through the night. Wolfgang spoke words in Valdric, his voice transforming as the ancient language flowed from him. He sounded different speaking his native tongue, more alive somehow, as if the language awakened parts of him that had been sleeping. Violet recorded everything on her phone, taking notes frantically, trying to capture not just the sounds, but the patterns beneath them. The language was beautiful, complex and flowing, with a musicality that made even simple words sound like poetry. It had more vowel sounds than English, and several consonants that required her to position her tongue in ways she'd never attempted before. Wolfgang was patient, repeating words over and over, using examples and comparisons to help her understand. Hours passed. The archive around them fell silent as other researchers finished their work and left. Eventually, they were alone again, just as they had been that morning. "Say it again," Violet said, attempting to mimic the word Wolfgang had just spoken. It meant something like moonlight, but specifically the quality of moonlight on snow. Valdric had 17 different words for types of light, and she was determined to learn all of them. "Sylvanath," Wolfgang repeated. The word shimmered in the air between them. "Sylvanath," Violet tried. It came out closer this time, though still not quite right. "Better. Your tongue position on the TE is improving." He leaned forward. "May I?" She nodded, not quite sure what he was asking permission for. Wolfgang reached out and touched her chin, tilting her face toward the light. His fingers were gentle, but sure. "The sound comes from here," he said, touching his own throat just below his jaw. "Feel how the vibration changes?" He spoke the word again, and she saw the subtle movement of his throat, the way his mouth shaped the sounds. "Can I?" Violet reached out, hesitating with her fingers inches from his throat. "Yes." She touched where he'd indicated, feeling the cool skin beneath her fingertips. "Say it again." "Sylvanath." The vibration traveled through her touch, and she finally understood the subtle difference she'd been missing. "Sylvanath," she said, and this time it came out right. Wolfgang's eyes lit up. "Yes, perfect. That's exactly right." His hand was still cradling her chin, and for a moment, neither of them moved. They were close enough that she could see flecks of darker gray in his pale eyes, could count the individual strands of his silver hair. "I should," she started. "Yes," he agreed, but neither of them pulled away. The moment stretched. Violet's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the weight of Wolfgang's gaze, the careful control in the way he held himself. He was giving her time to retreat, she realized, giving her space to decide. She didn't retreat. "It's almost dawn," Wolfgang said finally, his voice rougher than before. He pulled back, breaking the contact. "You should go home. Sleep." Violet blinked, shaking off whatever spell had fallen over her. Right. Yes. Dawn. She started gathering her papers with hands that weren't quite steady. "Same time tomorrow?" "I'll be here." She wanted to say something else, something to acknowledge what had almost happened between them. But Wolfgang had already stood and moved toward the window, positioning himself in the shadows as the sky outside began to lighten from black to gray. "Good night, Wolfgang." "Good night, Violet." He didn't turn around. "Sleep well." She left with her heart still racing and the phantom sensation of his fingers on her chin. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks. Violet would arrive at sunset. Wolfgang would already be there, waiting. They would work until dawn, sometimes longer if they pulled the heavy curtains closed, and Wolfgang positioned himself away from the windows. He taught her Valdric with a focus and intensity that took her breath away, and she absorbed it all like someone dying of thirst. The language became real to her. She began to understand how Wolfgang's people had thought, how they'd seen the world. Valdric had words for concepts that didn't exist in English. The specific loneliness of immortality, the grief that came from outliving everything you loved, the particular beauty of things that wouldn't last. It was a language shaped by vampires for vampires, and learning it felt like being given access to an entirely different way of existing. But more than the language, she learned Wolfgang. He was careful with her, she realized. He maintained distance even when they sat close together, never presumed, never pushed. But sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Sometimes their hands would brush, reaching for the same paper, and the contact would linger a heartbeat longer than necessary. He brought her coffee on the nights when exhaustion made her eyes blur. He started bringing books from his own collection, rare texts that weren't in the archive's holdings. He remembered everything she told him about herself, no matter how trivial, and asked questions that showed he actually listened. She was falling for him. It should have terrified her. He was a vampire, centuries old, carrying grief and power in equal measure. But when she was with him, none of that seemed to matter. He was just Wolfgang, patient and kind and heartbreakingly lonely. One night, about a month after they'd started working together, Violet looked up from her notes to find Wolfgang staring at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "What?" she asked. "You have ink on your face." He reached across the table, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Just there." The touch lingered. His thumb traced along her cheek down to the corner of her jaw. His eyes held hers, and she saw something in them that she'd been trying not to acknowledge. Want, longing, hope mixed with fear. "Wolfgang," she whispered, "I should stop." But he didn't move. "This is inappropriate. You're here for academic purposes. I'm not just here for academic purposes anymore." The admission came out easier than she'd expected. "You know I'm not." His hand dropped away. He leaned back in his chair, something like pain crossing his face. "Violet, I'm too old for you. I've lived too long, seen too much. I have centuries of baggage and grief. Getting involved with me would be a terrible decision. Maybe." She stood, moving around the table until she was standing directly in front of him. "Or maybe you're exactly what I've been looking for without knowing it. I'm a monster. You're a man who gave me his coat when I was cold and guarded me through the night when I was vulnerable. You're a man who's carrying 3 centuries of pain and still manages to be kind. You're a man who's teaching me his language because you trust me with his people's memory." She reached out, touching his face the way he'd touched hers. His skin was cool and smooth beneath her palm. "You're not a monster, Wolfgang. You're just lonely." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved for contact. "I can't offer you a normal life. I can't give you sunlit mornings or casual dinners or any of the things you deserve. I don't want normal. I want this. I want you." She meant it. The realization settled into her bones with absolute certainty. "I want late nights in archives and languages no one else speaks and someone who understands why dead words matter. I want you, Wolfgang Kravetz, if you want me too." His eyes opened. "If," the word came out rough. "Violet, I've wanted you since that first morning when I watched you sleep with your head on papers covered in my people's language. You looked so peaceful, so dedicated, so beautiful. I've wanted you every night since, and the wanting only grows stronger." Her heart soared. "Then why are we fighting this?" "Because I'm afraid." The admission seemed torn from him. "I've lost everyone I ever loved. I've spent 3 centuries alone because the alternative was risking that pain again. If I let myself love you, if I let you matter." His voice broke. "I don't think I could survive losing you too." Violet understood then. His careful distance, his controlled responses, his fear. He wasn't protecting himself from getting hurt. He was protecting himself from being destroyed. "You can't live in fear forever," she said gently. "That's not living, Wolfgang. That's just existing. Surviving. Surviving is all I've done for 300 years. Then maybe it's time to actually live again." She smiled at him, still cradling his face. "I can't promise I won't hurt you. I can't promise forever, because I'm human and mortal, and I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But I can promise tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night you'll have me." Wolfgang reached up, covering her hand with his. "You make it sound simple." "Maybe it is. Maybe we're the ones making it complicated." She leaned down, bringing her face close to his. "Do you want to kiss me, Wolfgang? More than I want my next breath. Then kiss me." He stood in one fluid movement, and suddenly his hands were in her hair, and his mouth was on hers, and Violet forgot how to think. He kissed her like a man drowning, desperate and hungry and tender all at once. His lips were cool but soft, and when she opened her mouth to him, he made a sound low in his throat that sent heat pooling through her entire body. She kissed him back just as desperately, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. This was what she'd been wanting for weeks, what she'd been denying herself. He tasted like dark wine and cedar, and kissing him felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wolfgang rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he said. "Good. I want everything changed." He laughed, and the sound was beautiful, warm and genuine and free of the weight he always carried. "You're remarkable. Do you know that? Terrifying and brilliant and entirely too brave for your own good." "I'm in love with a vampire king who speaks a dead language," Violet said. "Brave might be overstating it. Possibly insane is more accurate." Wolfgang pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "In love?" She hadn't meant to say it. The words had just slipped out, carried on the aftermath of that kiss. But now that they were spoken, she wouldn't take them back. "Yes," she said firmly. "In love. With you. I know it's too soon and too fast and too impossible, but there it is. I love you, Wolfgang." His expression transformed, joy, pure and bright, breaking through centuries of grief. "Violet Grayson," he said, speaking her name like a prayer. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since I woke that first morning to find you watching me with courage instead of fear." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring. And Violet thought that maybe languages weren't the only dead things that could be brought back to life. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Violet's life. She and Wolfgang fell into a new rhythm, one that included work but also included stolen kisses between linguistic discussions, held hands across research tables, quiet conversations about everything and nothing. He told her stories about his life before the massacre, about growing up in a castle that touched the clouds, learning to fight with sword and tooth, the politics of vampire courts, about his family, his friends, the lover he'd lost centuries ago. He spoke of grief but also joy, pain but also love, and Violet listened to all of it. She told him about her own life, her childhood spent moving from city to city as her father chased academic positions, the way she'd fallen in love with languages because they were constant when everything else changed. Her dreams of preserving endangered languages, of making sure no culture's voice was lost to time. They were good together. Despite all the reasons they shouldn't work, they did. Wolfgang made her laugh with dry observations about modern society. She made him open up about feelings he'd buried for centuries. They challenged each other intellectually, supported each other emotionally, and when they were together, the rest of the world fell away. The work progressed beautifully. Violet's reconstruction of Valdric was becoming comprehensive. She had phonology, morphology, syntax. She had vocabulary lists organized by semantic field. She had Wolfgang's recordings, hours and hours of him speaking his native language with fluency and emotion. It was going to be her dissertation, yes, but more than that, it was going to be a gift, a resurrection. 3 months into their work together, Wolfgang took her to see his home. It wasn't in the city. He drove them 2 hours into the mountains to a location that required a series of turns down increasingly narrow roads. The house, when they finally reached it, was built into the mountainside itself. Half castle, half modern mansion, all Gothic elegance. "I've lived here since I came to this country," Wolfgang explained as he led her inside. "I had it built to echo the architecture of my people's strongholds. It's an indulgence, perhaps, a way of remembering." The interior took Violet's breath away. Vaulted ceilings, stone walls, tall windows with heavy curtains, but also electricity and heating and modern furniture that somehow worked with the ancient aesthetic. Books everywhere, thousands of them, art on the walls that looked old enough to be in museums. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Wolfgang showed her through room after room, a library that made her weep with joy, a study with a desk that must have been 400 years old, bedrooms, sitting rooms, a kitchen he admitted he rarely used. And finally, he led her down a stone staircase to the lower level. The room at the bottom was different from the rest of the house. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with shelves, and the shelves held items that clearly meant something. Old weapons, pieces of jewelry, scraps of fabric, books in languages Violet recognized, and several she didn't. "This is my memory room," Wolfgang said quietly. "Everything I managed to save from my people, everything I've collected over the centuries that reminds me of them." He picked up a small silver comb. "This was my sister's. She wore it every day." He set it down, touching a dagger with a jeweled hilt. "This was my father's. He carried it into every battle." His hand moved to a book. "This is the only surviving Valdric text, poetry, written by our greatest bard. I managed to save it from the fires." Violet moved through the room slowly, reverently. Each item was a piece of a lost world, a fragment of the people Wolfgang had loved and lost, the weight of it pressed against her chest. "You've been carrying all of this alone," she said. "All these memories, all this history. Just you." "Yes?" Wolfgang stood in the center of the room, surrounded by ghosts. "I'm the only one left who knows what these things mean. When I die, all of this becomes meaningless, just objects with no context, no story." "Not if we finish the work," Violet said. She turned to face him. "Not if we bring Valdric back. Not if we make sure your people are remembered properly, with their full culture and language and history documented and preserved." An idea was forming in her mind, wild and ambitious. "Wolfgang, what if we didn't just reconstruct the language? What if we did more? A full cultural archive. Recordings, translations, genealogies, histories, everything you remember, documented and preserved. We could create a digital archive, make it accessible to scholars. We could publish the language, teach it, make sure it lives again." Wolfgang stared at her. "That would be immense, years of work." "I have years, and you have centuries." She crossed to him, taking his hands. "We could do this, Wolfgang. We could make sure you're not the last keeper of ghosts anymore. We could share the burden." "Why would you do that? Why would you dedicate your life to my people?" "Because they matter. Because you matter." She squeezed his hands. "Because I love you, and this is important to you, and I want to help carry what you've been carrying alone." He kissed her then, deep and fierce and full of desperate gratitude. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright, not with tears, vampires couldn't cry, but with emotion that transcended tears. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not," Violet agreed, smiling, "but you're stuck with me anyway." They stood there in his memory room, surrounded by the fragments of his past, and planned their future. Hours of discussion about methodology, about what should be prioritized, about how to organize 300 years of memories into something coherent. It was ambitious, possibly insane, but Violet had never been more sure of anything. They were going to bring Valdric back, together. The work intensified. Violet reduced her teaching load to the bare minimum, dedicating every spare moment to the project. Wolfgang cleared his schedule completely. They worked at the archive some nights, but more often at Wolfgang's mountain house, where he had access to his memory room and all the artifacts that could provide context. Violet recorded everything. Wolfgang speaking in Valdric about his childhood, his education, his coming of age, about vampire politics and court intrigue and the delicate balance between different lineages, about wars and alliances and betrayals. He spoke about daily life, about festivals and rituals, about how his people had worshipped and mourned and celebrated. She took notes until her hands cramped, asked questions until her voice grew hoarse. She cross-referenced everything, built timelines, created family trees. The scope of the project expanded beyond anything she'd initially imagined. This wasn't just linguistic reconstruction anymore. This was anthropology, history, cultural preservation on a massive scale. And through it all, they fell deeper in love. Wolfgang was different now, less guarded. He smiled more easily, laughed more freely. The weight he'd carried for centuries seemed lighter, as if sharing his memories had helped him finally begin to heal. He was tender with her, protective, passionate. He loved her with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed her, and she loved him back just as fiercely. They were happy. For 5 months, they were perfectly, gloriously happy. Then, the Reinhardts found them. It started with small things, a sense of being watched when Violet left the archive late at night, a car that seemed to follow her home, strange clicks on her phone line. Wolfgang noticed too. He started insisting on walking her to her car, on checking her apartment before he left her each dawn. "I'm probably being paranoid," he said one night, his expression troubled. "But I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." "The Reinhardts are all dead," Violet reminded him. "You said you tracked them down centuries ago." "That generation, yes. But hunter lineages have long memories. And recently," he hesitated, "there have been rumors. Talk of a Reinhardt descendant trying to rebuild the family name. Someone young, ambitious, determined to prove themselves. By hunting vampires. By hunting me specifically." Wolfgang's jaw tightened. "The family has considered me their great failure for 3 centuries. I'm the one who got away, the one who survived their perfect massacre and then made them pay for it. Killing me would restore their reputation." Fear coiled in Violet's stomach. "What do we do?" "I'll be more careful. I'll increase security at the house, and you—" He cupped her face in his hands. "You need to be careful too. If they know about me, they might know about you. They might use you to get to me." "Let them try," Violet said with more bravery than she felt. "I'm not going to hide or run or let fear dictate my life. We have work to do, important work. I'm not letting some hunter family stop us." Wolfgang's expression was torn between pride and terror. "You're going to give me a heart attack and I'm already dead." She kissed him. "We'll be careful, both of us, but we're not stopping." Agreed. Agreed. They were careful. Wolfgang hired security for his house. Violet started varying her routes home. They both watched for signs of surveillance. For a week, nothing happened, and they began to relax. Then, Violet went to the archive one night, and Wolfgang wasn't there. He was always there before her, always waiting. But tonight, the reading room was empty. She tried calling him. No answer. She texted. Nothing. She waited 30 minutes, then an hour, her anxiety growing with every passing minute. Finally, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We have your vampire. Come to the old foundry on 3rd Street if you want him back. Come alone. You have 1 hour." Violet's blood turned to ice. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a trap, that she should call the police, call someone, call anyone, that going alone was exactly what they wanted. But they had Wolfgang. She grabbed her bag and ran. The foundry was abandoned, a massive brick building on the industrial edge of the city. Broken windows, rusted doors, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. Violet approached it with her heart in her throat, looking for signs of ambush. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside. The interior was dark and echoing, full of shadows and rusted machinery. But in the center of the space, under a skylight that let in moonlight, she saw him. Wolfgang was chained, silver chains, the kind that burned vampires on contact. They wrapped around his wrists and throat and chest, attached to a support pillar. His shirt was torn and burned where the silver touched his skin, and his face was tight with pain. But his eyes, when they found her, blazed with fury and fear. "Violet, no," he said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't have come. You need to run." "Not without you." She started forward, but a voice stopped her. How touching. A woman stepped from the shadows, young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and a face that was beautiful and cold. She wore tactical gear and carried weapons that looked disturbingly modern and efficient. Behind her, 4 more figures emerged, all armed, all watching Violet with predatory focus. "You must be the scholar," the woman said. "The one trying to resurrect forbidden knowledge. I'm Elena Reinhardt," she said the name with pride. "And you've been very busy with something that doesn't belong to you." "Valdric belongs to itself," Violet said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a language, not a secret. And Wolfgang is the last speaker. He has every right to teach it to whomever he wants." "Wolfgang?" Elena turned her attention to the chained vampire. "Is that what you're calling yourself now? How pedestrian. I preferred your old name. Valdric, the Blood King. Much more appropriate for a monster." "Let her go, Reinhardt." Wolfgang's voice was pure command despite his chains. "She has nothing to do with our family's war. This is between you and me." "On the contrary, she has everything to do with it." Elena circled closer to Violet. "You see, when my ancestor made the mistake of leaving you alive 300 years ago, you became our family's shame, the one that got away, the monster we failed to slay. For generations, we've tried to find you, tried to finish what was started. But you're clever. You hide well. We'd almost given up." She smiled. "Then we heard rumors. A vampire matching your description, spending time at a members-only archive. A human woman researching Valdric, a language that was supposed to be extinct. We started watching. And what do you know? The great Blood King, brought down by love. How perfectly tragic." "What do you want?" Violet asked. "I want you to destroy your research," Elena said simply. "Every recording, every note, every file. I want Valdric to die the way it should have died 300 years ago. And I want you to watch while we finish the job my ancestor started." She nodded to one of her companions, who pulled out a wicked-looking blade. Wooden, Violet realized with horror. A wooden stake. "No!" The word tore from her throat. "Please, you don't have to do this. The war is over. His people are gone. He's just one vampire. He's not a threat to anyone." "He's an abomination," Elena said coldly. "A remnant of a race that should have been wiped out entirely. And your work would make him a martyr, give his people posthumous glory they don't deserve. I can't allow that." "They were people," Violet said desperately. "They had culture and language and families. They deserved to be remembered. Not forgotten, not erased, remembered. They were monsters who fed on humans and considered themselves superior. They deserved exactly what they got." Elena turned to Wolfgang. "Any last words, Blood King?" Wolfgang's eyes were locked on Violet. "I love you," he said clearly. "Whatever happens, remember that. You gave me 5 months of happiness after 3 centuries of grief. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything." "No," Violet whispered. "No, please. I'll destroy the research. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt him." "You'll destroy it anyway," Elena said. "After you watch him die. The loss will be more meaningful that way." The hunter with the stake moved forward. Violet did the only thing she could think of. She started speaking in Valdric. The words poured from her, every phrase Wolfgang had taught her, every grammatical structure she'd learned. She spoke about moonlight and grief, about the loneliness of immortality, about the beauty of things that wouldn't last. She spoke about Wolfgang's people, about their pride and their culture, and their right to be remembered. The language flowed from her like music, like prayer, like defiance itself. Elena held up a hand, stopping the hunter. "What is she doing?" "Speaking their language," one of the other hunters said, sounding uncertain. "The dead language." "It's not dead," Violet said, switching back to English. "As long as Wolfgang lives, as long as I remember what he taught me, Valdric lives. You can kill him, you can destroy my research, but you can't erase what I've already learned. You can't silence me." She met Elena's eyes. "And if you kill him in front of me, I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows about your family's atrocity. I'll publish everything. I'll make Wolfgang and his people famous. I'll make the Reinhardts synonymous with genocide. Is that really the legacy you want?" Elena's face twisted with fury. "You're bluffing." "Try me." Violet's voice was steel. "I'm an academic, Elena. My entire career is built on research and publication. You think I can't find platforms? You think journals won't be interested in a first-hand account of vampire culture? A full linguistic reconstruction? The story of a peaceful people massacred by hunters?" She took a step forward. "You're not preserving your family's honor. You're risking exposing what they really did. The whole world will know the Reinhardts for what they are. Murderers, genocidal murderers who killed children and burned libraries." The other hunters were looking at Elena now, uncertain. This clearly wasn't going as planned. "And another thing," Violet continued, her confidence growing. "Wolfgang hasn't hurt anyone in centuries. He's been living quietly, bothering no one. But you've kidnapped him, chained him with silver, threatened to murder him, all on video, by the way." She pulled her phone from her pocket, holding it up. She'd started recording the moment she'd entered the foundry. "I've been streaming this entire conversation to a secure server. If anything happens to either of us, it goes public, automatically." It was a complete bluff. Her phone was just a phone, but Elena didn't know that. The hunter leader stared at Violet with something between rage and grudging respect. "You're clever. I'm motivated. I love him, and I meant what I said. You can't silence Valdric, not anymore. It's already coming back. Killing Wolfgang just makes him a martyr. Killing me makes this a murder investigation. Either way, you lose." Violet took a deep breath. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to unchain him. You're going to let us walk out of here. And in return, I won't press charges, won't publish the video, and won't make your family's name mud." "And the research?" Elena asked tightly. "Continues. But I'll be discreet. Academic publications only, proper scholarly channels. Wolfgang's people get remembered, but not sensationalized. They get dignity. Everyone wins." The hunters exchanged glances. Elena's jaw worked as she clearly warred with herself. Finally, she gestured to the one holding the stake. "Let him go." "Elena," one of the hunters protested. "I said let him go." Elena's voice cracked like a whip. "She's right. Killing him now creates more problems than it solves. We're supposed to be restoring our family's honor, not adding to their crimes." The hunters moved to Wolfgang, unlocking the silver chains with obvious reluctance. The metal fell away, and Wolfgang staggered forward. Violet ran to him, catching him as his legs nearly gave out. The burns on his skin were already healing, but she could feel him shaking. "We're leaving," she said, supporting Wolfgang's weight. "Don't follow us, don't contact us, stay away or that video goes public." Elena watched them with cold eyes. "This isn't over." "Yeah, it is," Violet said firmly. "Your ancestor made a choice 300 years ago. A wrong choice. A choice that killed innocent people. You don't have to keep making that same wrong choice. You can be better than they were. That's real honor, Elena, not finishing an old genocide, being brave enough to stop one." She didn't wait for a response. She helped Wolfgang toward the door, half carrying him, expecting at any moment to feel a stake in her back. They made it outside. Into the car. Away. It wasn't until they were miles from the foundry, safely on the highway, that Violet pulled over and let herself shake. Wolfgang, recovered enough to move on his own, pulled her into his arms. "That was the bravest, most foolish, most incredible thing I've ever witnessed," he said into her hair. "You faced down 5 armed hunters. You bluffed your way past them with nothing but words and courage. You saved my life." "You would have done the same for me," Violet said. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "Actually, you did do the same for me. That first night, you guarded me when I was vulnerable. This was just returning the favor." Wolfgang pulled back, framing her face with his hands. "I love you, Violet Grayson. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You're magnificent." She kissed him, hard and desperate, needing to feel that he was real and whole and alive. "Can we go home now? You're home. I don't want to be anywhere else tonight." "Yes, we're going home." The aftermath was complicated. Wolfgang hired better security. Violet moved into his mountain house, deciding her apartment was too vulnerable. They reported the incident to the authorities, though they left out the supernatural elements and described it as a hate crime assault. Elena Reinhardt and her hunters were questioned, but not charged. There wasn't enough evidence, and Violet's video mysteriously failed to materialize. But the investigation scared them off. The Reinhardts left the city, and the hunters stopped following. The work on Valdric continued, but carefully. Violet published her initial findings in an academic journal, presenting the language reconstruction as exactly what it was: legitimate scholarly research. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Linguists were fascinated. Other researchers reached out, wanting to collaborate. Wolfgang was hesitant at first, wary of attention, but as he saw how respectfully Violet's colleagues treated the material, how much they genuinely wanted to understand and preserve Valdric, he began to open up. He agreed to be interviewed, to provide additional recordings, to serve as a cultural consultant. The project grew. Violet secured funding. She assembled a small team of trusted researchers. They created a comprehensive digital archive, full linguistic documentation, cultural histories, translations of Wolfgang's memories, photographs of artifacts from his memory room. Everything carefully curated, meticulously sourced, properly contextualized. A year after they'd started, Violet published her dissertation. Valdric, Linguistic Reconstruction and Cultural Memory of a Lost Vampire Lineage. It was 300 pages of dense linguistic analysis, anthropological insight, and historical documentation. It was her magnum opus. It was Wolfgang's people, resurrected in ink and data. The defense was open to the public. Wolfgang sat in the audience, looking uncomfortable in modern formal wear, but present nonetheless. Violet presented her research to her committee, fielding questions with confidence and passion. When she finished, when they told her she'd passed with distinction, when she officially became Dr. Violet Grayson, she looked straight at Wolfgang. He was smiling, a real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. 6 months later, the university hosted a special lecture series. Lost Languages of Europe. Violet was the keynote speaker. The auditorium was packed. Academics, students, journalists, curious members of the public, and sitting in the back row, carefully positioned away from the windows, was Wolfgang. Violet stood at the podium and spoke about Valdric, about its structure, its beauty, its unique worldview, about the people who had spoken it, who had lived and loved in this language for thousands of years, about how languages carried entire ways of seeing reality, and how each lost language diminished humanity's collective understanding. Then she did something unprecedented. She switched to Valdric. The audience leaned forward, listening with rapt attention as she spoke Wolfgang's native language fluently. She recited poetry from the book in his memory room, translated for the audience afterward. She sang a traditional song Wolfgang had taught her. She demonstrated the 17 words for different types of light. And in the back row, Wolfgang closed his eyes and listened to his language spoken aloud for the first time in 3 centuries, spoken by someone other than him, spoken with love and respect and perfect pronunciation. After the lecture, during the reception, people came up to Violet with questions and congratulations, and Wolfgang, moving through the crowd to reach her, finally didn't feel like the last of his kind. His people were remembered now. Their language lived again. His burden was shared. When he reached Violet, she took his hand without hesitation, right there in front of everyone. "You did it," he said quietly. "You brought them back." "We did it," she corrected. "Together." He kissed her forehead, not caring who saw. "What happens now?" "Now?" Violet smiled up at him. "Now we keep going. There's still so much to document, so much to preserve. And I'm thinking maybe I could start actually teaching Valdric. Create a course, maybe. Give your language a future, not just a past. You want to teach people to speak Valdric? If you're okay with it. I know it's personal. I know it's precious. But languages are meant to be spoken, Wolfgang. They're meant to live and grow and change. Your people are gone, but their voice doesn't have to be. What do you think?" Wolfgang looked around the auditorium at all the people discussing Valdric with genuine interest and respect. He thought about his people, about the language they'd spoken, about the culture they'd built. He thought about 300 years of loneliness, of being the sole keeper of ghosts. I think, he said slowly, that my people would be honored. I think they'd want their language to live again, even if they can't. I think, his voice caught. I think they'd approve of you, Violet. I think they'd love you as much as I do. She kissed him, there in the crowded auditorium, and he kissed her back. Around them, a few people noticed and smiled. Most didn't pay attention. It was just a kiss, just two people in love. But for Wolfgang, it was resurrection. Not just of his language or his people's memory, but of himself. For 3 centuries, he'd been frozen in grief, trapped in the past. Violet had given him a future. They left the reception together, walking out into the night hand in hand. The moon was full, and Wolfgang looked up at it with something like peace on his face. Sylvanath, he said, the quality of moonlight on snow. Sylvanath, Violet repeated, her pronunciation perfect. They went home to the mountain house, where Wolfgang's memory room now held not just artifacts, but also complete documentation, where his people's history was preserved digitally and would never be lost, where he was no longer alone. Over the following year, Violet's course on Valdric became real. A small seminar, only a dozen students, but they learned. They spoke the language, studied the culture, engaged with the material respectfully and seriously. Wolfgang Guest lectured sometimes, sharing stories about growing up Valdric, about what life had been like. The students hung on every word. The digital archive went public, accessible to researchers worldwide. Other linguists began building on Violet's work. Someone created a Valdric language learning app. Someone else started a cultural preservation blog. Slowly, carefully, Wolfgang's people's legacy spread, and through it all, Violet and Wolfgang built their life together. It wasn't always easy. They had to navigate the complications of a human-vampire relationship, the challenges of different life cycles. But they faced it all together with love and patience and absolute commitment. 2 years after the lecture, Wolfgang proposed. He did it traditionally, in Valdric, speaking words that no one but Violet would have understood. She said yes in the same language, and they were married in his mountain house, surrounded by artifacts and memories and hope for the future. They talked about children eventually, about how that might work with Wolfgang's vampire nature. They talked about Violet's mortality, about whether she wanted to be turned someday or live out her natural life. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they had time. They had love. They had each other. And on quiet nights, when they sat together in Wolfgang's library, Violet would read aloud in Valdric, and Wolfgang would listen with his eyes closed, at peace for the first time in 300 years. His people were remembered, their language lived, and he, the last speaker, was no longer alone. The burden of grief had been shared, and in sharing it, had transformed into something else entirely. Not loss, but legacy. Not endings, but beginnings. 5 years after that first morning in the archive, Violet and Wolfgang stood together at an academic conference where Valdric was being discussed as a model for language resurrection projects. Scholars from around the world had come to discuss methodology, ethics, and possibilities. A panel specifically focused on working with last speakers of endangered languages. Wolfgang sat on that panel, speaking about his experience, about what it had meant to him to have his language taken seriously, preserved, taught, about how linguistic death and cultural genocide were connected, about the importance of letting communities tell their own stories. The audience listened with rapt attention. And afterward, a young linguist approached them, asking if Wolfgang would be willing to consult on another lost language project, another last speaker who needed help preserving their people's voice. Wolfgang looked at Violet. She squeezed his hand and nodded. "Yes," he said. "I'd be honored to help." Because that was what they did now. They preserved what would otherwise be lost. They gave voice to the silenced. They made sure that languages and cultures and people were remembered with dignity and love. It had started with a woman falling asleep in a library and a vampire who draped his coat over her and guarded her until sunrise. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, a resurrection, a legacy, a love that had healed old wounds and created new hope. And when Wolfgang looked at Violet, his wife, his partner, his salvation, he knew that surviving for 300 years had been worth it, because it had led him to this moment, to her, to a future that honored his past without being trapped by it. "Ready to go home?" Violet asked after the conference ended. "Always," Wolfgang said, taking her hand. "As long as home is wherever you are." They left together, walking into a future that held both of them, that held Valdric and all it represented, that held the possibility of helping other languages and other last speakers find their voice again. The sun had set hours ago. The moon was rising, bright and full. And in the space between night and day, between past and future, between grief and joy, they had found each other. And they had found home.